So this week in the Sacred Gathering, it's our first Sunday after Christmas. In the traditional church calendar, Christmas is not a single day, although that's what we often talk about it in this culture. It's actually an extended kind of period or season because, like Jesus, kind of the stories about Jesus being born, this was something that happened over a long period of time as people realized before that he was coming, as he was born, as other visitors representing the Gentiles, like the Magi, show up later on. And so Christmas is not just kind of a single day. It's a season in which we kind of progressively recognize some of the significance of the fact that God came and became human, who came to live among us and teach us and heal us, eventually dying on a cross, returning to glory, starting the process of kind of a resurrection of the entire world, including his followers that want to be something. So in a lot of ways, Christmas continues to be a wrestling with this incarnation, this God coming among us. And kind of toward that end, the traditional reading on the first Sunday of Christmas that I'm getting from the chapter 2 of the book of Hebrews is a really interesting one for us to kind of wrestle with in this first Sunday of Christmas. So let me read that. In Hebrews chapter 2, starting at verse 10, we read, "It was appropriate for God, from whom and through whom everything exists, to use experiences of suffering to make perfect the pioneer of salvation. This salvation belongs to many sons and daughters whom he's leading to glory. This is because the one who makes people holy and the people who are being made holy all come from one source. That is why Jesus isn't ashamed to call them brothers and sisters when he says, 'I will publicly announce your name to my brothers and sisters. I will praise you in the middle of the assembly.' He also says, 'I will rely on him,' and also, 'Here I am with the children whom God has given me.' Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he also shared the same things in the same way. He did this to destroy the one who holds the power over death, the devil, by dying. He set free those who were held in slavery their entire lives by their fear of death. Of course, he isn't trying to help angels, but rather he's helping Abraham's descendants. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers and sisters in every way. This was so he could become a merciful and faithful high priest in things relating to God, in order to wipe away the sins of the people. He's able to help those being tempted, since he himself experienced suffering when he was tempted." So it's a pretty dense passage, as most of the book of Hebrews is. And there's one phrase or one or two phrases in here that just really struck me, and I think people have reacted pretty negatively to over time. And so the first of those is this: "It was appropriate for God." People haven't really liked that idea because, like, who gets to say what's appropriate for God? Who gets to say what God should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing? Who is judging the standards of God's behavior when he's doing something appropriate and when he's doing something that isn't? And yet, the number of times I've been in conversations when I've heard people largely say exactly that, right? Like, well, I would never follow a God who does X, Y, Z, or I don't want to believe in a God who, is wrathful in the Old Testament or who allows genocide in the world, those sorts of things, right? Which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because what kind of a place is that putting us in, that we get to say God, the most powerful being in the world, should behave this way or should not behave that way? I think it actually says a lot more about us and what we value than often trying to understand who God actually is and what it actually means to follow God in those ways, right? And so I think this passage and the Bible are very clear that if we want to know who this God is and the sorts of things he's up to, we can't hold out this kind of ideal. Well, I think God should be this way, and I think God should be that way, and God to me is this XYZ. None of that really holds up very well, because the Bible is pretty clear. If you want to know who God is, you look at Jesus. And yet, this passage also has another section down here in verse 17 that people have largely found offensive since day one. It says, "Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers and sisters in every way," right? Most of the early church heresies, and I would say many people's kind of weak views of God nowadays, have to do with trying to pad that or to make it not actually true, that Jesus was not like the rest of humanity, in every way, shape, or form, right? He was not made like his siblings in every way. Some of the early heresies didn't like this, the idea of Jesus like even eating, right? And so they have these views that he was just kind of pretending. He's kind of a ghostly presence pretending to be a person. Or he couldn't actually have suffered. He couldn't have been tortured, right? He couldn't have XYZ. He could not have shared in our humanity in its fullness. And yet, that does seem to be the message of Christmas, that he was fully human. And so I think a more interesting question is not historically what has embarrassed people about God or the idea that God was actually fully human. Maybe what sorts of things that are very human do we feel uncomfortable with God experiencing? Or what sorts of things do we feel uncomfortable thinking about Jesus in those ways? Because if we're like that, God would never have to be that. And I see that even, I remember reading recently in a theology book, someone was just kind of offended by the idea that God could feel pain. They wanted a God who was transcendent above it, who didn't have to be in the muck and feel things the way they do. They just said something like, wouldn't God just hurt all the time? My belief is he probably does, right? The way he feels and loves the world and was fully human. What is it about God and the idea of the incarnation that we're trying to get away with, that we're trying to clean up constantly? And not usually what does that say about God, but what does that say about us? And so this passage, I think, is a great one for kind of remedying that idea of how stuck we get on our ideas of God, and that he won't stop piling on kind of new images of who Jesus is, maybe the ways we can understand him, which is good for us who tend to get stuck in one way or another. So let me just look real briefly at there's 3-4 really distinct images of who God is and the ways we could think of Jesus in this passage alone. So the first one we get is right at the beginning, right? It was appropriate for God, for whom and through whom everything exists, to use experience of suffering to make perfect the pioneer of salvation. So this image is kind of this pioneer, this trailblazer going through, I don't know, imagine a jungle, right? Cutting a path so other people can follow. And so what is it that Jesus is kind of cutting his way through? Well, it's suffering itself, right? It's pain, it's sin, it's death, all these things that we don't really want to apply to God. We want God to be transcendent in a way and not having to touch that kind of grime, right? And yet Jesus comes and experiences it, and yet that is not also what defines being human. There is a path through, even death itself. And Jesus goes before us to make a way, to show us that it is possible to outlast any of these things. And so he experiences suffering, but we're going to see in his life a lot. He also experiences redemption, right? The fact that God is moving in history and bringing about good things in both. He knows what it feels like to be in need and to have God provide. And so the process of following this God, of following that trail, they refer to in here is, this is because the one who makes people holy, and the people who are being made holy all come from one source, right? So this process of following Jesus, not around, not avoiding pain and suffering, not even avoiding death, but through following the path that Jesus carved, is called holiness and becoming holy. It's a very different way than what we tend to think of as holiness, which I think for most of us has to do with like purity or cleanliness, right? Holiness seems to be the process of following Jesus through the grime and letting Jesus show us something beyond it, of following him well into that rather than getting to be squeaky clean. Interesting image. Another one that is all over this that I think still kind of offends many people is this idea of basically a sibling of God, right? It says it in there a bunch of times. The salvation belongs to many sons and daughters, whom he's leading to glory, like we just said. He's not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. I will publicly announce your name to my brothers and sisters, right? Here I am with the children whom God has given me. The idea of being a peer in some way, shape, or form, or of being a sibling of Christ, of being, maybe to use a different, slightly different, or of being a friend, not a servant, not a slave, but a peer, someone on the same level as Jesus because of the work he did in lifting us up, that we're all children of God. It still offends us in a lot of ways. There's still this kind of mentality that I remember Richard Foster once called worm theology, right? The only way to approach God is to look at our sin and be like, oh, I'm a worm, I'm the worst, I'm terrible. And that's built in. We are dark, terrible beings. Or maybe more accurately, for those of us who trust Christ and let that stuff die on the cross, who follow the path through death, right? We're not that anymore. We are not worms, and worm theology does not help us. Jesus is saying embarrassing things to us. He's not ashamed of us. Someday in that throne room, we can waltz in like we own the place, because we do. Not because we're great, but because Jesus is great, and he extends and shows that path to us, and he is making us into something that is meant to be a sibling of Christ. He switches to a very different metaphor in 14 and 15, right? Therefore, since the children share in one flesh and blood, he also shared the same things in the same way. He did this to destroy the one who holds the power over death, the devil, by dying. He set free those held in slavery their entire lives to the fear of death. And so there we've switched to this kind of like conquering hero. We've switched to this conquering liberator, right? When in the ancient world, when a king or a general would go into a place, they often had to free the captives of their own people who'd been captured in prior battles or who'd been conquered by somebody else, right? And this is actually the kind of root of a lot of the redemption and ransom language that the Bible uses, both for the Exodus and also for Christ's work, right? It is Christ coming and conquering the devil and death and the darkness, and has set us free by his strength and by his power. This is one that, depending on your tradition, probably people feel a little more comfortable with, until we look at what this actually meant in Jesus' life, how he actually did this. But I also don't want us to lose that metaphor if it's one that makes us uncomfortable. And I think it's really important to note that we do not need to be afraid as Christ's siblings, as Christ's beloved who have been freed, right? And there is a lot of fear in the world right now. There's a lot of fear that things are going to go wrong and that we're going to die or bad things are going to happen to us. And this passage is an invitation to freedom, to trusting God that even death, there's something beyond that. We do not need to be afraid. And then, giving us whiplash right after he goes in this conquering language, he switches to priestly language. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers and sister in every way. He did this so that he could be merciful and faithful high priest in things relating to God, in order to wipe away the sins of the people. He was able to help those being tempted, since he himself experienced suffering when he was tempted. And so a priest in the Old Testament language is kind of the person who stands between God and the rest of humanity, right? They're using the rituals, they're using the sacrifices to bridge this gap and make it possible for them to be in one another's company, right? For reconciliation, to fill the gap, the bond that is keeping us away from God here. But again, this is not just any old ritual. We also have someone who is sympathetic, who understands, not just in the abstract, what it looks like to be captured by sin, to have things deeply wrong within us. And it says he understands the experiences of suffering. He's able to help, and he is one who does ongoing intercession for us, right? So it's not just this one-time advocate that Jesus did on the cross. Christ continues to advocate for us, to intercede for us with God and the Holy Spirit, to bring about what is good. It's this ongoing process and this goodness that we're invited into. And so what does it mean that Christ shares our experiences, shares our very nature with us? It means that our image of God needs to be based on who Jesus was and how he spent his time and who he spent his time around, and the fact that he was willing to come and associate with us so fully. He understood the fullness of being human, so he could do all these things. Blaze a trail through, be a good priest, conquer death and sin and the devil and break us free, right? So that we could be fellow siblings, so that we could be God's own children. And so the question is, what is our kind of idea of God? What is our idea of the significance of this? Are we going to let Jesus and what the Bible says about Jesus define how we view God, or are we going to take a more abstract view of God? Maybe one that's a little cleaner, or a little more transcendent, or maybe a little more powerful than Jesus appeared in his real life. Because the invitation that it says again in the Garden, he came and he shared in our very nature so that we can share in his, right? We are meant, as Jesus became like us, we are meant to become more like Jesus in our holiness, in our willingness to follow on that path, and our willingness to become the kind of people that God would have us be. It's both a beautiful and freeing, and at times kind of terrifying path we are invited into, knowing the incarnation that God came among us and invites us to follow and become more like him.